The Biden administration has said that all jet fuel is going to be sustainable by the year 2050. What does this mean? How would it work? And I'm also going to tell you why this plan is not going to change anything at all. Let's jump into it. So the Biden administration came out this week with a plan to make all jet fuel sustainable in aviation in America, and then through that try and influence the rest of the world, because a lot of flights do actually fly to America. What does that actually mean? Well, according to the White House, this new sustainable aviation fuel grand challenge is to inspire the dramatic increase of production of sustainable aviation fuels to at least 3 billion gallons by the year 2030. This would also mean more funding opportunities and more research put into the sector of around 4.3 billion US dollars. So that's quite a lot of money being poured into this area, something that airlines have currently only dabbled in. Part of the grand plan also includes more research and development into how aircraft can be more fuel efficient. So, more sort of Boeing 787 fuel efficient aircraft rather than quad-engined Boeing 747s. It also means that they're going to be looking at airports and other aviation-related activities to see how the industry as a whole can be more sustainable, as well as using US leadership to inspire other countries around the world. But as we know in the global stakes, it only really comes down to America, Europe, India, and China in having a massive impact on the environment. So whether or not this aviation sustainable plan will have the impact that the US government is hoping for, it remains to be seen. Part of this plan also includes working with NASA and the FAA to bring forward more research and development into more fuel-efficient aircraft. This will mean that companies like Boeing and Airbus will have access to the countless amounts of data from NASA to build aircraft that are at least 30% more fuel efficient, which is something that I think is really exciting because we've seen a lot of designs, such as blended wings and other things like that almost completely change the way we travel, and I can't wait to see what happens with that sector. Part of this also includes a reward for companies of at least $100 million to develop these aircraft designs. The White House has said, "This will transform the aviation sector, create good-paying jobs, support American agriculture and manufacturing, and help us tackle the climate crisis." Currently, aviation accounts for 3% of all of America's greenhouse emissions. And it's that last point that I really want to hammer home, because if you're going to talk about sustainable aviation, we need to talk about aviation in the grand scheme of things when it comes to greenhouse gases and the several different challenges that are required to come across in order to make aviation more sustainable. Now, for the record, I am all about sustainability and making the environment a better place, but sometimes I feel like that aviation has a significant focus on it when we ignore other giant polluters. And let me explain why. This is the sector by sector global greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see, energy is 73.2% of all the greenhouse gas emissions, followed by agriculture and land use before waste and industry. If we're to look for aviation, I want to focus your eyes way down here in the corner where you can see it's 1.9%. Aviation only makes up not even 2%, 1.9% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And so when they're talking about making it completely sustainable just in America by the year 2050, you'll look at reducing only like the slightest amount. Like, look, even shipping's 1.7, road transport, all the cars is 11%, but we're not looking at all of the manufacturing that we have, all of the resident buildings running air conditioning, and other areas such as all the steak. Aviation is only not even half, like 1/3 of all the steak farming and all the cows and the livestock that we see around the world. So when people start to talk about this sustainable aviation, they don't really see how it fits into the grand picture. That being said, I am all for looking for ways to make all sectors more efficient. But when we're picking and choosing different industries to work with, it starts to get a little bit unfair. Anyway, I'm going to now jump into why this plan is not as concise as it may seem, because fuel is only one tiny bit of the grand sustainable aviation puzzle. So when it comes to making sustainable aviation, there are 6 problems into our future that we need to deal with. The first, of course, is jet fuel. Now, if you didn't know this already, jet fuel is possibly one of the most densest fuels available to put planes into the sky. There are different ways of powering aircraft, everything from no power like a glider to electric planes, biofuel planes, and the planes that we have running today. Now, the planes that are running today are using a kerosene-based fuel that is highly energy dense, and it allows, say, an A380 to fill right up and fly across the Atlantic. There is no current battery powered technology that can be used for planes to make them fly over long oceans. Electric aircraft do exist and do have a very good place in the future. However, battery technology is not at the point where you could slap in some batteries in an A320 and fly any significant distance. So what can you do about fuel? For one, you can make the planes more efficient, and that's why we saw quad-engine aircraft like the Airbus A380 and the Boeing 747 and Airbus A340 go the way of the dodo. You get rid of those 4 engines and just replace them with 2. Now you've only got half the amount of gas-guzzling engines sucking up all of your fuel. Now, those planes can be made more and more efficient, but you're going to reach a point where the efficiency can no longer be made possible with just the aircraft. You're gonna have to change the fuel. The next step is to use biofuel. It's all about sourcing the raw materials for the jet fuel in the first place. What you can do is oils like palm oils or ethanol, and then start to mix that into the fuel itself, and that's going to give you more environmentally friendly sources, such as from agriculture rather than mining. However, that's now going to start to compete with land for food and native habitats such as orangutans, and that's what we're seeing with the palm oil epidemic that we have in the world. So you need to start to ask yourself if the cure is worse than the disease in this scenario. Wouldn't it just be better to use the jet fuel that we're currently bringing from just oil wells? Because considering if we only used oil for that purpose, we would have plenty and it wouldn't have that much of an impact, 2% on global emissions. And then we get back to electric energy, which I've already described is kind of a dead end until we can either put nuclear reactors in planes. And if you're wondering about that, the US government did do studies about powering large aircraft with nuclear reactors, and it is very possible. I'll put a link up in the description where you can watch all about the nuclear bomber technology of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which I think wasn't a dead end, and who knows what we could have got. Or we need some great revolution in battery technology, which would be a total game changer across the board for the world, and something that I do not seriously have the credentials to comment on. But, they are working as hard as they can, and we should hopefully expect something soon within the next 50 years. Okay, that's jet fuel. But what about the 5 other problems that need to be solved? The second one is that it's not exactly about carbon emissions that's the problem with planes. You see, planes also release other emissions, especially in the higher upper atmospheres, that have an impact on the climate. The other thing that I need to mention is that sustainable aviation fuels, as you can see from this chart, are far more expensive. Even with mass production down the line, it's going to really cut into the bottom line compared to the current oil production that we have today. So sustainable aviation is going to come with a price that either the government or the passengers are gonna pay for it. Whilst aviation only contributes 2% of all the carbon emissions, they actually contribute 80% of upper atmosphere warming with their contrails. According to a study done back in 2020 in Japan, contrails are actually contributing significantly to the warming of atmospheres over the flight paths, especially at night. Generally, nighttime, the hot air is able to rise up into the atmosphere and allow the heat to escape. But this is now putting a layer of carbon emissions up in the atmosphere that is reflecting the heat back down into the cities and warming up the atmosphere so less heat can escape. So even if an aircraft is running on a low carbon dioxide fuel source, it could still be contributing significantly with its contrails, having up to 3 times the impact on the temperature of the local area. Currently, at the moment, the world governments are ignoring this fact, with only the EU starting to consider legislation to look more detailed into the effects of contrails. And I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist here with the tinfoil hats and everything like that, but we need to also understand that these aircraft do have impacts in the atmosphere apart from just carbon emissions. And if you're going to ignore the bigger impact for this 2% small impact, you're starting to look up the wrong tree. And that takes us to our next problem, the frequent flyer problem. Recent studies in the United Kingdom have found that 70% of all flights are undertaken by only 1.5% of the entire country's population. A recent study undertaken in the United Kingdom found that 15% of the population undertook 70% of the flights, with a significant number of people not even flying for years at a time. That's right, it turns out that it's a small subset of the population, yet again in the world, that is taking the majority of the flights. And because I know my viewers and I know myself, I think we're talking about ourselves in this scenario, that we're the people that are taking multiple flights all of the time and having the biggest impact on the environment. So I'm not saying that we're to blame, but when you look at the stats and statistics, it turns out that us as people are the actual issue when you nail down to it, because these flights wouldn't be flying at all if we weren't buying the tickets. In fact, it's so bad that one study estimates that 1% of the world's population contributes 50% of all of aviation's emissions. That means that frequent flyers contribute 1% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the entire world, which is literally kind of ridiculous. So how do you solve this problem? Well, people have started to consider something called a frequent flyer levy. Imagine this scenario that you haven't flown at all this year and you decide to go to Mexico. You get one round trip for free to fly without paying any additional tax on top. For every flight after that, you start to pay more and more tax for every significant flight. Therefore, your frequent flyer balances out compared to the people who don't fly very frequently at all. Whilst this sounds absolutely fantastic in principle, it actually ends up not making any sense, because the frequent flyers are generally more rich, are flying on points, or their companies are paying for them to fly. So they don't necessarily care about any additional taxes on top because they're gonna fly anyway. So therefore this whole scheme just falls into a heap. There is a more extreme way to get around this problem, and that's banning flights to specific cities. How this would work, say for example you were flying from New York to Boston, you would no longer be able to take that flight, and instead they would completely scrap all those flights completely. You would only be allowed to take the train. Sure, it would be a little bit slower, but that would save up to 80% of the equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. And this is probably the only plan on this list that actually makes a lot of sense, because considerably a lot of these small flights that are taking up all of the greenhouse gas emissions don't really make a lot of sense when it's only like half an hour or more train trip or bus journey. Currently, the scheme is underway in France, where they've banned several different flights from Paris to nearby cities that could easily be completed by high-speed rail. But what's that you're saying? Your country doesn't have high-speed rail? Well, here we are, and now you see the other problem with this, because outside of perhaps Europe, some very specific sections of America, China, and Japan, I think this plan doesn't quite work. Can you imagine trying to do the Sydney to Melbourne route by road? As you can see, it's 878 kilometers, and the road drives through this mountain range, well, around this giant mountain range here, and it will take 8 hours and 45 minutes compared to an hour and a half, including the time taxiing and walking through the airport, by plane. And it's around about the same price when it comes to fuel. So when they start to talk about these sorts of schemes, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The fourth problem is many of these schemes lie outside policy of several countries. As I've said at the beginning of this video, this whole scheme was designed for America to show the way when it comes to sustainable aviation. They're doing this because they don't really have any way of imposing a tax, say on a flight from Dubai to Beijing, and making those schemes more sustainable. That's why it's up to a global tax system on aviation fuel to actually make this whole idea work, which you can imagine is a mind-boggling complex and horrible idea that is just going to put up fares for everybody involved and also make it really hard for international relations to work. What we might see is America and areas like the EU imposing a kerosene tax on any flights that are using stock standard fuel. But knowing areas like the Middle East have access to plenty of oil, they're probably not even going to flinch. And on that topic, we also need to mention how the world of aviation is rapidly changing. Take China, for example. They are now the world's biggest aviation market, taking over the United States back in April of last year. They are not even considering sustainable aviation at this current time because it's their turn to grow. When countries like America start to impede their passenger travel with all this sustainable aviation taxes and fees, China's just going to keep going to the moon, and it looks like there might be nothing to stop them. If China's going to continue to grow and keep its mantle as the world's largest aviation market, it's now up to them